hopefully that makes it better and more discursive. Jeff and I are going to talk to you about an exhibition which we worked on together with the curator at Brighton Museum called Martin Pell. And we're both going to talk for about 25 minutes and then we'll take questions. I'm going to start off talking about the evolution of the project and about why we started an exhibition. So it's like the hidden story. And some of the curatorial challenges I faced, and then Jeff's going to talk about how he engaged with them. Okay, so this image was very well known to me since the 1980s. It was actually painted in 1936, and it's by the artist Gluck. It was called Medallion, so it's sort of like two faces on the same coin, and it's one of the most famous depictions of same-sex love. I became aware of this because in the 1980s I bought Virago's reprint of The Well of Loneliness, and this was the image that was chosen to go on it. And I've always lived in or near Brighton, and Gluck was an artist who gave lots of the objects that she owned to the museum and lived locally, so it was always someone I was aware of. About 3 years ago, Martin Pell, who's the curator at Brighton Museum, invited me to work with him on what's called a collections review. And a collections review is something a museum undertakes where you examine a collection. A curator examines their collection, every single item in it, and they invite an external person to work with them. So over a period of about 6 months, we worked really hard, and we looked at literally tens of thousands of objects. And at the end of it, you write a critical report about what's the strengths of the collections, what's the weaknesses of it. And what came out very clearly was that at Brighton, they're never going to have a collection that is world famous for Chanel or Dior, but what they do have is a collection of clothes worn by unconventional people, quite often arty women, and one person's wardrobes. And one of the few things that we thought that people from around the world would come to Brighton Museum for or would ask about is LGBTQ dress, because Brighton's got the largest population of LGBTQ sort of per capita in the UK. So as we were going through the collections review, it's wardrobe after wardrobe after wardrobe of clothes, and they're not classified by the person whose clothes they are. So you don't see sort of like Mrs. Fairbrother's clothes. They're categorised by evening wear, by period. And as we went through the collection, we thought that we would start seeing menswear clothing that Gluck, the woman on the right, had worn. Completely famous for dressing in menswear, having menswear haircut, going to a barber. And Nesta Obermer is the absolute love of her life. Nesta's married. In the end, she never leaves her wealthy husband, but Gluck falls completely in love with her. And she paints this for what she regards as the occasion of their marriage. So on the left is a very famous portrait of Gluck by Howard Coster. Gluck was born into a wealthy Jewish family in North London, defied expectations to marry, have children, ideally marry a cousin, became an artist, was financially supported for the rest of her life. So she was a rebel in some ways, but was a rebel who was cushioned by wealth. And in the collection, we found the smock that Gluck had donated on the right. And we started to think it would be amazing to be able to do an exhibition about Gluck and a book. And also because it was timely, because 2017 was the 50th anniversary of the Partial Decriminalisation of Homosexuality Act. And it made sense for Brighton certainly to be having various projects. So at the moment they've got an exhibition of Glyn Philpott's work, Gluck, and the Museum of Transology. So these were the sorts of images that Martin and I were familiar with. They're pictures by Emile Hoppe, famous society portrait photographers who Gluck went to every time she staged an exhibition, and had these really dashing portraits made. Now Gluck sometimes described as like a lesbian dandy, but we felt very strongly that Gluck isn't a lesbian dandy. Gluck is dressing in menswear clothing, and it's a different aesthetic as we go on to explain. So this is the image of Gluck that Martin and I had. This is what we found in the store. So 1 year before she died, Gluck went to Brighton Museum, which was a local museum, and what I should say is when we've written the texts in the exhibition, in the book, we've avoided gendered pronouns, but I haven't developed the language yet where I can talk without saying she, and I've known her as she for a long time. So we don't find breeches, we don't find man-tailored jackets, shirts and ties. What we find, amongst other things, is a cluster of flowery dresses and lots of very random objects, including the cheapest costume jewellery with stones missing. Now, these are the sort of things that do not fit into Brighton Museum's collection. It's a museum that's got a very, very good collection of decorative arts. It's design-led. The objects they've got in the museum are very, very good. Customarily, these objects, which are not high quality and are not of interest, they're not directional, they're not design-led, they're not the sort of thing the museum would customarily have taken. But 1 year before Gluck died, she went to Brighton Museum and presented these objects. So the intriguing thing for us was, it wasn't as if Gluck had died and someone had gone and sort of gathered all the things that were left in the house and took them to the museum. Gluck went, in her right mind, and chose each and every one of these objects to give to the museum. They include a Vogue pattern, some things that we've attributed to possibly belonging to family members. But the clothes are quite clearly clothes that were not worn by Gluck. So straight away it didn't fit into our category of one person's wardrobe. So sometimes when you kind of hope that you're going to find all these dashing suits and Homburg hats, but actually when you're looking to tell stories with objects and you don't find the objects you want, sometimes the stories you can tell are actually more intriguing. So we got the museum to agree to do an exhibition, and we were introduced to the family, and the family had made an archive. And the archive comprised loads and loads of box files of photographs, of documents, some love letters, but lots of paper evidence. So the sort of evidence that showed the type of clothing that we were familiar with, Gluck. So Gluck wearing a shirt and a tie, wearing workwear, wearing like a reefer coat up there. And it's not only the clothes that Gluck wore, it's Gluck's dressed appearance, it's her demeanour, it's her gesture, it's the way that the artist clenches a cigarette in the teeth in a way that a fashionable woman might have held a cigarette. And so one of the challenges in the exhibition was, well, how do you represent a life, and how do you represent the dress of a person when those clothes don't survive? And so that was one of the challenges that we discussed with Jeff. How do you stage an exhibition when you don't have the objects that tell the story? One of the ways you obviously can do it is you can tell a visual narrative by examining photographs and images. So the Gluckstein family were very wealthy. They owned lots of hotels in London. They were based in North London. They owned the chain, which to people much older than you will be familiar with. It was called Lyons Corner House Tea Houses. There was a Lyons Tea House in every town in the country. There were 2 in Brighton. The family shared their wealth. The men administered the family money. Gluck was the oldest in her family. Here she is with her younger brother Louis, who is exceptionally tall. If Gluck had been born a boy, she would have gone on to administer the family wealth, and it was a source of constant grief to her throughout her life that while she was completely financially independent with maids and chauffeurs, every time she wanted something she had to apply to the family fund, and the men decided how the wealth would be distributed. So this is Gluck brought up, expected to have children, ideally marry a cousin, the man work in the family firm, but Gluck takes a different path, and Gluck decides she'd got a very fine singing voice. She could have been a singer, but she decided to become an artist. There are no photographs in the archive of Gluck's teenage years. So we have photographs of Gluck aged 4, 5, 6. We have none of Gluck's teenage years, and a lot of people have, in recent years, defined Gluck as trans. And obviously it's something that you can't project contemporary sort of notions into the past. But there is evidence that a lot of people who are trans have sort of destroyed, or they don't keep the images. And there's none showing Gluck as a young woman. So in the museum we find different categories of dress. and they're different sizes. This is on the right. On the left is Gluck with Nesta. They're skiing. Sorry, they're skating on holiday. So Gluck's on the right, and Nesta's clearly much taller. We know that Gluck's 5'2" from her family and from other people who knew her. So that's my height. This dress on the right is for a woman who is much smaller, and the dress on the left is for a woman who's about 5'6". Now these have come into the museum with no historical documentation. They came into the museum, and the director of the museum at the time, John Morley, liaised with Gluck, because Gluck was an artist, didn't let the curator, Lou Taylor, who would have asked all sorts of interesting questions, have access to Gluck. So there's one reference in one letter that the flowery dresses belonged to Gluck's friend. I mean, it was obviously a lover, Edith, and no other evidence. And quite often in exhibitions, curators impose meanings, or they tell their own stories as if they're fact. And in this exhibition, we felt very strongly that we wanted people, whether they defined as trans or lesbian, or they were interested in art history or local history, that they could come and find narratives that appealed to them. And that also, we said, we just don't know. There is no evidence. And so we've shown, which Jeff will show you, we've shown our research process. We show how we've come to some of the conclusions we've come to, but we're saying there are all sorts of other stories that could be told. So all the time we've got a narrative with the audience saying, well, we just actually for sure we don't know. This is Jean Jaffa, who was Gluck's niece, who really sadly died just before the exhibition opened. She said Gluck was my height. And so, you know, we never got to hear Gluck's voice. So it was very difficult to feel that we never really got to know Gluck. But the nearest you can get is talking to the people who knew Gluck. And so we talked to Jean Jaffa and other family members. Now, the family were extraordinary because although Gluck was a complete rebel and didn't conform to the status quo, they have archived her papers, and incredibly, they gave us complete access, and they didn't try and censor what we did at all. They said, you can tell any stories you want, the narratives are your own as long as they're factual. So we agreed with them that all text we'd submit to them so that they could check the names and the dates. And that's incredibly freeing, because often if you work with a fashion designer doing an exhibition, or you work with a family doing a biography-based exhibition, they really want to impose, you know, the story they want you to tell. And so we were completely free. Now, when Gluck died, everything that was deemed valuable, financially valuable, was sold at auction. So she's given the things that she wants to give to the museum. She lives in the Chantry House in Stenning, which is about 8 miles west of Brighton. And everything that's valuable, the historical furniture, the paintings, is sold at auction. Everything that's left, the items that are seemingly mundane, the household utensils, the kitchen utensils, old clothes, go to the local jumble sale, which is sold for charity. Now, incredibly, we met one woman called Barbara Buckley, who as a student had worked at the auction house on a Saturday, became obsessed with Gluck, couldn't afford to buy anything, but went to the charity jumble sale and bought lots of things. Some of the things have got lost over the years, but one thing, it's actually not a cravat, it's actually a silk scarf that's been folded in two to make a cravat, survived. And we've got all sorts of photographs of Gluck clearly liking spotted scarves, spotted cravats, spotted neckties. Just before the exhibition opened, someone else came forward and said that they'd bought these shorts at the jumble sale, and we'd got pictures of Gluck wearing similar shorts. And the same person gave us the trousers and these big silk knickers from the 1930s. Now, we don't know who wore the knickers, but Jeff, Martin and I had endless debates, would Gluck wear them? So she wears great big heavy menswear clothes, thick tweed, bulky clothes that hide the feminine body. These aren't performative clothes, they really are menswear clothes, and as bulky as they get. So even when Gluck's indoors, like at the Fine Arts Society here, you know, she's wearing a heavy coat. She's indoors, she's there all day, it's her exhibition. So we had endless debates about these knickers, and in the end we thought, well, we're intrigued, why don't we just put them in the exhibition and say we just don't know. So they went in the exhibition. So as a dress historian, and all of my work stems from objects, and it's usually garments. And so whether I'm writing a book or curating an exhibition, I start with garments, and I try and not have too many preconceptions, and I go on a journey where those garments take me. I research every aspect of them I can think of. But in this case, it's still original objects, but I worked from visual evidence. So I constructed a dress history of Gluck's dressed appearance using surviving images. So in 1916, Gluck leaves the family home. She likes to say she ran away with like sixpence in her pocket. But she actually went with another art student who took the name Craig. So Gluck's proper name is Hannah Gluckstein. At this point, she abbreviates her name to Gluck, and she runs away with her first lover, Craig, and they move to Lamorna, which is a very liberal arts-based, arty community in Cornwall. The very famous equine artist Munnings is a painter there, and he draws this picture of Gluck, and it's variously called Gluck dressed as a gypsy, or Gluck sitting on a hillside. And today, obviously, we wouldn't use the term gypsy, we'd say Roma. On the back of this drawing, which has been kept within the family, Gluck's made a note saying the Romany caravan was a fiction, but her smoking a pipe wasn't. So here she is sitting on a hillside, barefoot, at one with nature, wearing long flowing garments that are pulled in at the waist. It's what we might describe as anti-fashion in 1916. It's not what fashionable women were wearing. But it was a well-known style of arty dress in 1916, and it was a style that was what often called gypsy style of dress. It's popularised by Dorelia John, who's an artist at the Slade, and her husband, Augustus John, who also dressed in Roma style. He spoke Roma languages. And the other women in the arts community dress. They become completely obsessed with Dorelia John, and they start wearing her style of dress. So there's Dorelia on the left, Augustus on the right, and other women like Dod Proctor, Ellen Aper in Cornwall start wearing gypsy style dress. So it's not surprising 3 years later when Gluck arrives that her first sort of rejection of feminine fashionable dress should take this form. I was trying to put the images in chronology, and trying to develop a sort of stylistic history of Gluck's dress. So it then seems that by about 1918, 1919, rather than dressing as an arty woman, Gluck's appearance is more like that of an arty man. She starts wearing theatrical cloaks, big hats. On the left, it's a photograph of a painting, we don't know where the painting is, of her with Ellen Aper, who she was completely infatuated with. We don't know if they had a relationship. And Gluck's looks almost vampiric. She's wearing trousers, heavy shoes. She's got her hair cut short, and she's wearing this great big black cape. And on the right is a portrait made of Gluck by the lesbian artist Romaine Brooks in the early 1920s. By about 1922-23, it seems that Gluck, she's made the transition from arty feminine dress to masculine arty dress. She starts wearing tailored menswear and dressing, for all intents, like a man, which is why the trans community have recently started situating Gluck as part of their historical trajectory. So there are lots and lots of portraits of Gluck, almost always in profile, wearing man-tailored clothing. Now, some historians have said, like Laura Doan, that actually Gluck's appearance is like that of a fashionable woman in the 1920s. It absolutely isn't a garçon look. Gluck is wearing menswear. She's not wearing fashionable menswear style clothing. Every time Gluck's exhibitions are reviewed, the press comment on Gluck's appearance. This is one article that just focuses upon Gluck's clothes. Can you read it? If I just give you a minute to read it, because it's actually quite interesting. It's published, I think, in 1926, but we don't have a source. In the book, I've got the proper accreditation. But basically, there's been a lot of discussion about whether Gluck described herself as a woman. And here she says other women. In other correspondence, she says to Nestor, I am your husband, and describes herself as boyee. But she's saying that she's got used to wearing men's clothes, and it's what she's going to stay wearing. Now, this is what... there's no pictures of Gluck in the evening, so Gluck could get away with wearing masculine tailored clothing in the daytime, but you could not, under any circumstances, go into a posh London hotel or a restaurant dressed in menswear, even if you're rich and cushioned by sort of social status. So we can look at the sort of evening wear that a woman in Gluck's social position might have worn, but if we look at the day wear, on the left we've got the most amazing Chanel day wear coat and dress. Chanel always often used the same fabric that was made for the dress to line the coat, and here it's all cut out. This is from 1927, it's in the Met. These are the sort of dresses that maybe more arty women would have worn. So, you know, comparative analysis is a very good way of also constructing a narrative, because you can look at what Gluck's wearing and then you can look at what Gluck's contemporaries might have been wearing at the same time. Now, as I said, lots of people have said that Gluck is a fashionable garçon, and if the one designer that absolutely promoted that style was Chanel, but when Chanel wears trousers, she wears them with masses of jewellery, she wears them with hats with brooches on, she wears them with makeup. There is no way that Gluck feeds into this, in my opinion. This is how Gluck dresses. Gluck wears really bulky, +4 suits in thick wool and thick tweed with shirt and tie, thick socks, and masculine shoes. Invariably holds a cigarette. Now, even for a very affluent man to wear this in Bond Street is completely inappropriate. It's the sort of style that you wore in the country. So not only does Gluck not look like a fashionable woman, she doesn't even look like a fashionable man in Bond Street. But if we are going to liken her to any sort of style, she's much more like the Prince of Wales than she is to any fashionable woman in terms of her dressed appearance. And then Gluck wore workwear clothing for painting and for leisure. So here we've got Nestor wearing everyday fashionable women's wear from the 1930s, and on the right we've got Gluck in a one-piece workwear, what we call a boiler suit today, which is really, really radical and really unconventional to wear outside of an artist's studio at this time, especially for a woman. Now, we don't know if Gluck was aware of the Italian futurists like Thiat, who designed this one-piece tuta, which was supposed to be a sort of revolutionary garment that all the world would wear. But we do know that Gluck wasn't an emancipator of women. She's not interested in art and industry and art for everyday life and the artist as proletariat. Gluck leads an exclusive, wealthy, cushioned, affluent life, which is very much about... It's devoted to the women she loves, and it's devoted to her painting. And these are the styles that Gluck wore from being a very young woman, and then right up into old age. We've got similar photographs of Gluck wearing workwear and menswear clothing. And this is the poster for our exhibition. So I'm now going to... So these were some of the issues that were generated in the discussion that Martin and I had when we were working on the exhibition. And then we said we would really like Jeff to design our exhibition and come and work as an exhibition maker on it. And he's going to talk about what he brought to the project.
So just bear with me while... No, it's all right. Just bear with me while I find my presentation. That's it. In Brighton, so if you want to go and see it, get down really quickly. That's fine. Yeah, so as Amy said, Amy and Martin had been working with Gluck's collection and thinking about the exhibition for a while before I was brought into the project. And I was brought in as an exhibition maker to really address some of the issues and some of the problems that as curators Amy and Martin had unearthed as they'd gone through the collection. And Actually, one of the difficulties that I faced is there was the book and the exhibition. And when I was brought in to work on the exhibition, the book, I was thinking about what was I going to write for my chapter for the accompanying publication. The publication date was then moved so far ahead of the exhibition work, I had to completely revise what I was going to think about. So I started to think actually about this project, firstly in terms of what was I going to write for the publication, and then moved into the exhibition. And so faced with the problem of what will I write about, because we hadn't started work on the exhibition proper, I started thinking about a proposition around the role of objects in exhibitions in relation to biographies, and how objects and exhibitions can be combined as biographic narrative. And so what I composed for the book was a typology of objects within a biographic setting of an exhibition. And I've written in the book, which is for sale, get it from Amazon or go down to the exhibition and find it. And in my chapter in the book, I've written a typology which has notions of the spectacular object, the humble object, the relic, the imprinted object, and the two that I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about this evening, which are the narrative object and the representational object. So as I said, these are propositions for object types as an object sits within a biographic exhibition. So the narrative object was something I'd been thinking about since I saw this exhibition in Antwerp quite a while ago at Two Women, Zwei Frauen, which was by pure coincidence about Chanel. And at one space in the exhibition, there was a room which is called the Chamber of Secrets. And in this space, there were 5 horizontal vitrines, and each of them purported to contain one of Chanel's typical secrets. So you can see in one of the vitrines, there's a tweed Chanel suit turned inside out so that you can see the construction, the chain weighting. In another of the vitrine, there was cosmetics that Chanel developed and fragrance that Chanel developed and marketed and retailed. In another of the display cases, there was the typical Chanel two-tone shoe, the slingback shoe. And then one of Chanel's secrets of Chanel that the curators wanted to communicate was the idea that Chanel was the pioneer really of the garçon haircut, the short cut cropped bob. And of course, how do you represent a hairstyle in an exhibition? There's not really material culture that you can bring in and display as an object. And what the designers did here was, well, the curator and the designer, what they did was they used a long tress of brown hair, tied at the top with an off-white ribbon, and they juxtaposed it with a pair of heavy dressmaking shears. So within that display case, you had something that symbolized the act of cutting hair. Now, all of the other objects on display in this room were from the Patrimoine Chanel. They were from the Chanel archive. The shears and the ponytail were objects that the curators had invented, really, as objects and imported into the exhibition. But I started thinking about these in terms of this idea of the narrative object and how you can bring in objects to tell a story that aren't actually part of the original collection or the bequest or the gift of the person who's given them. So thinking about Gluck, one of the absences that we faced was, as Amy said, a complete absence really of any of Gluck's tailored menswear. And we thought about how to, and you can see the tailored menswear in the images shown there. We thought about how was it possible to start articulating Gluck's menswear in the exhibition without any material objects. What we did have, and this came from the collection of Barbara Buckley, who Amy's already mentioned, bought from the jumble sale, which was one of the ways in which Gluck's artifacts were disposed, is a collar box. This is a very cheap collar box. These were made in the 19th and 20th centuries for men to keep detachable collars. They were quite often exquisitely made in wood or in leather, quite often tooled leather with silver embossing. This is a very cheap version made in cardboard to look like leather. You can see from the rim of the box in the large image that the cardboard is actually starting to fray, the layers are starting to peel apart. But what we have here is an unmistakably masculine object. And in the absence of the Homburg hat and the tweed overcoat and the tweed jacket, we have here an object that we know is actually from Gluck's provenance, which has an undeniably masculine presence. Now, when Barbara bought it from the jumble sale, it was full of Gluck's handkerchiefs. So we also know that it belonged to Gluck and that Gluck used it. So in fact, this object was one of the few objects that we have that we can use to represent Gluck's adoption of masculine appearance. The more I thought about this notion of how can we represent Gluck's masculine dress in the exhibition, I started looking into the writers who've written about Gluck and written about the clothes that she wore. And most of the writers who wrote about it concentrate on what she wore. And I thought, well, there's an interesting position here where there's a point where she makes a decision and decides not to wear feminine dress. And I actually think that that point of rejection of the feminine, that really critical point of articulating her dressed identity as masculine, is something that a lot of writers miss in focusing directly on what she ended up wearing. And I started wondering if we could use material to represent that point of choice. So to represent a point of time in Gluck's biographic narrative where she decides that feminine dress, fashionable feminine dress, is not what she is going to accept. And when I started talking this through with Amy and Martin, Amy and Martin both know the collection at Brighton incredibly well, and both started talking about this fantastic late 1920s dress, an evening dress, which was given to Brighton Museum by Martin Battersby, who was a well-known collector of decorative arts, particularly Art Deco and decorative arts from the 1920s and 30s, who actually knew Gluck. So there is a tangential connection there. But this dress that Martin Battersby gave to the collection in Brighton is very typical of incredibly fashionable evening wear that a woman of Gluck's social status would have worn towards the late 1920s. And what I proposed was that we construct some kind of installation in the exhibition that juxtaposes the Martin Battersby dress, which is typical of feminine dress of the period, with the collar box that Gluck owned, which is representative of her choice to go down the path of wearing masculine dress. It was really important, when we first started talking about the dress, Amy said as well, oh, and there's a fantastic period mannequin, and we could put it on the mannequin. And I instantly thought, that sounds really fantastic, but then the dress becomes an even more seductive item. What I wanted to somehow articulate was rejection, and so we started thinking about how we could display the dress as if it had been discarded. So the dress as something that is rejected. And we started to devise this display that juxtaposed this very fashionable 1920s dress with the masculine collar box. And you can see in the small image here a rendering that I did, which was a proposal just to talk through with Amy and Martin, which is illustrated in the book. And that rendering was done probably over a year before we started installing and putting the exhibition together. But you can see in the large image the installation of the dress and the collar box as we started to put it together in the exhibition. So actually the ideas that we talked through early in the process were ideas that travelled all the way through with us and were realised in the show itself. And then in the final installation, what we have is the dress lying horizontal, as if it's been thrown on the floor. And it's floating on a piece of transparent acrylic above a wallpaper which is made from line drawings of fashionable dress fashionable women's dress from, I think it's a Vogue from 1926. So the dress and the illustrations are exactly of the right date. And then printed onto the display case, onto the acrylic of the display case, is an excerpt from the quote that Amy showed you that you were reading earlier, where Gluck talks about, I've rejected women's dress, and now I don't know how women, and now I'm very comfortable in men's attire, and I don't know how I would never go back to women's wear. So we used that quote to actually bring Gluck's voice into that installation. So moving on to the second object type that I want to talk about, and this was an idea that I started thinking of around the notion of a representational object. And how do exhibitions that deal with biographic narratives or with a specific figure, how do they visually represent that figure in the exhibition? And I'm going to show some examples from the following exhibitions. There's the Rara Avis, which was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. That was an exhibition of the collection of Iris Apfel, who everyone is very familiar with now from the film that came out a couple of years ago, Iris. An exhibition on Daphne Guinness at FIT in New York. Daphne Guinness, the Guinness heiress, who is an extraordinary supporter of designers such as McQueen, who acquired a lot of material from them, and then her wardrobe was exhibited. Isabella Blow, Fashion Galore, a journalist and fashion editor and stylist who worked for a number of publications in the UK and the US. The exhibition was Isabella Blow, Fashion Galore at Somerset House. And then an exhibition, Simonetta, la prima donna della moda italiana, which was staged at Palazzo Pitti in Florence. And that exhibition was about Simonetta, who was one of the leading women's wear designers in Italy, particularly based in Rome, through the 1960s and 1970s. And each of those exhibitions have tried to represent their subject in a slightly different way. So Iris Apfel, for anyone who knows her, there are a number of signifiers that signify Iris. And one of the most distinctive are these very large round glasses, which she's known for wearing. And she, a number of years ago, she actually worked with, I think it was Bloomingdale's in New York. And they did a series of window displays using some material from her collection, but also garments that they were selling in their women's wear department. And they styled the mannequins in the shop windows with large round iris glasses. But here you can see her in the exhibition, well, not her, you can see a mannequin assuming her identity in the exhibition at the Met. The mannequin dressed in clothing from Iris's collection, sitting on an ostrich, which is a piece of sculpture that Iris owns, which I think is in her house in Palm Springs. And they've used the large round glasses as signifiers of Iris. So as a representational object, those glasses stand for Iris in person. I think it's interesting when you look at those images, for anyone who's kind of familiar with that public image of Iris, that very endearing, nonagenarian style icon, somehow as soon as I saw the mannequin wearing those glasses, it's almost like there's a transference of how I feel about Iris onto the mannequin itself as well. And I think that's when a representational object in a biographic exhibition really starts to work. For the exhibition on Daphne Guinness's wardrobe at FIT, they translated Daphne's signature hairstyle into wigs that were worn on the mannequins. So again, anyone familiar with the image that Daphne Guinness presents would have recognized that as a representational object in the exhibition. Isabella Blow was well known for wearing bright red lipstick, which was quite often smeared on her teeth or smeared over her face or around her mouth. And that red lipstick in the exhibition Isabella Blow Galore became a signifier of Isabella, almost a stand-in for the real person. Here you can see it on a mannequin where the mannequin head is covered in a stretch fabric, and the lipstick is actually a shiny material that's applied under the stretch fabric. And then for the exhibition Simonetta, Simonetta had an incredibly stylish mid-century image, and part of the image was a gesture, this gesture of holding the cigarette. And there are a number of photographs where that gesture is seen as a repeated gesture. And this, I suppose, started me thinking of the idea of a representational object as something that's more than a concrete object. So a representational object that could be gesture, that could be stance, that could be a tone of voice, or that could be fragrance, or could be sound. And if you think of sound, if anyone's seen the film Iris, over the beginning credits, there's this clanking noise, and it almost sounds like there's interference on the film. And then as the credits fade, you see Iris moving around her New York apartment, and the clanking noise is coming from the bangles that she wears on her wrists. And so that, you could actually say, is a representational object in terms of sound. It's a sonorific representation. But for Simonetta, this gesture, this Simonetta gesture of the arm held, the wrist bent back, the fingers arched, exhibition maker Judith Clark, who's one of our colleagues in the Centre for Fashion Curation, translated this gesture into into these arms that were positioned in front of the mannequins. So you see the gesture, I guess, realized in a sculptural form and presented in the exhibition as a suggestion of Simonetta's presence. When I started to think of what would a representational object for Gluck be, we were so familiar with these images of Gluck by this point. These repeated representations, photographic, sometimes drawn, sometimes painted, of a profile, which was actually very fashionable at the time. I think the presentation of profile in photography was a particularly fashionable thing to do. And what we see is Gluck presenting this not just in staged or very constructed images, which you can see here. We also see Gluck presenting the profile in self-portraits, which Amy's already talked about, Medallion, where we see Gluck in the foreground and her lover Nestor Obermer in behind her. Here we have less formal photographs of Gluck, and again she's presenting the same profile, which actually, if you think about it in terms of a snapshot, someone's taking a photograph very quickly, it's actually quite difficult to suddenly, almost instantaneously, turn your head into that profile. But Gluck seems to adopt this stance and this image very frequently. So I started to think in terms of visual analysis of this profile. What are its constituent parts? What are the components of this image, this facial identity? And the first one is evidently the profile, the head turned to the side. The second component part is that the head is tilted downwards, and the gaze is often tilted downwards. So these component parts build up into this image of Gluck. The third component is the hair, and the way that the hair is textured in this very sleek texture quite often, and the hair is combed backwards into this wave, very beautiful Art Deco wave formation. So these are the three component parts of this dressed appearance that Gluck presents. I'd worked on a project previously with the Digital Anthropology Lab at London College of Fashion, where we worked with a Merce Cunningham dance costume and how we could start to represent the body in relation to that costume. And it was such a fantastic experience working with them. I brought up the Gluck project in conversation, and Holly Shaw, who works in digital anthropology, said, yep, she'd be interested in collaborating. I went along with Holly and I talked through these ideas of could we do something with this profile, the tilted head, the sculpted hair, that might be something anthropomorphic that we could use in conjunction with a mannequin. So I left Holly with a lot of research that I'd done in terms of the images of Gluck. I also showed Holly some images of decorative arts and sculpture that were contemporaneous to the Gluck photographs. So here's an image by the French sculptor Antoine Bourdelle, and this is the frieze on the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, which Bourdelle sculpted, very much in this high Art Deco style. So when I talked to Holly, it was definitely about somehow representing Gluck in the exhibition, but not trying to construct something that was waxwork-like, doing something that was stylized, not something that was hyper-realistic. So at that point, I've got to say, I went off on holiday for 3 weeks and left Holly with my research and said we'd meet up and we'd talk about it a little bit more when we got back. And actually, when I got back, what I found was that Holly had just raced away with the whole thing, and it had gone in a direction that I hadn't expected, but which I really loved. My initial idea was that we'd probably do something that was much more like a bas-relief, to be very definite that we weren't trying to do something that was realistically representational. Holly had sculpted something far more three-dimensional, but actually I was so convinced by it and so intrigued by it, that was the process that we decided to follow. So I'm not familiar with this sculpting process at all, so I've just got to look at my notes so that I can give you a bit of an idea of what Holly did. So what we did was we did a 3D scan of the mannequins that we were going to use in the exhibition. So we had a complete life-size 3D scan of the neck, so that we could then construct something that was going to fit over the neck of the mannequin. Holly found a generic head form, a generic 3D head form online, which became her basic block for the sculpting process. And Then she used, oh, she hasn't, I thought she'd said the software. She used Freeform, which is 3D modeling software, to start cutting away and adding to the generic head block. And this process is quite an extraordinary process, and I took Amy down to have a look at it as we were doing it. You work with you can see the construction in the center, which is a weighted block that sits on the desk with an articulated arm that holds a pen. And whereas in traditional sculpture, you'd work with the material directly in front of you, so you'd be using that connection between brain and eye and hand to have direct impact. With the freeform digital modeling, you're using a pen and you're looking at the screen, and as you move the pen towards the block on the screen, you feel resistance in your hand. But what I found really extraordinary is that the connection isn't really between brain and eye and hand directly. The connection's between brain and eye to screen and brain and eye to pen. And I found it an incredibly disorientating thing, but obviously Holly got to grips with it. I've got to say this was the first time she'd used this process as well, so the results are even more extraordinary. But we went through a number of iterations of sculpting the head and making small adjustments. Particularly, we found the area between the nose and the lip, the area of the septum, we found very difficult to get right. And I think it's the point when you see the head, an image later with the head and Gluck's face, it's the point that's still not quite right. But the nose, I think we managed to get, the jawline particularly, and then this suggestion of the sculpture in the hair. On the smaller image, you can see the back of the head, and we used a cutout technique where we cut right through the block, so that in the exhibition, when it's actually printed, you can see into it. So again, we would trying to, I guess, kind of undermine any sensation that this was like a real head, that this was like a waxwork, to show that it was very much a digital product. So the final product, we looked into different methods of production. We decided that nylon filament production wasn't going to work because it was going to be too expensive. There was another resin process which we couldn't use because it was the printing box for the nylon process was smaller than the head that we needed. So we worked on a new 3D printing system, which is it's using plaster, and the plaster is impregnated with what's called a cyanoacrylate, which is like a super glue. And you can print a very kind of thin layer of the plaster with this technique. It also means that the surface that you have that's the result of the print is a very beautiful, very sculptural surface. It is actually like a plaster model. So that's an image. The large image is an image of the final 3D printed output. I've got to say that as part of our research process, we sent the digital files off to the printer, printed it. I went to pick it up very excitedly, took it down to Brighton, got the head out of the box, put it on the mannequin, and it was too big. And it was only slightly too big, but it looked appallingly comic. So we had to very, very quickly work out a percentage reduction. And it turned out that the printed head was 16.7% larger than an average woman's actual head. We did a percentage reduction in the digital files, reprinted it, and it came out absolutely fine. But that was part of this research process. Holly and myself had never gone through this before. At some point, possibly in the transfer of the file, there'd been some kind of digital glitch, and there was this large head, but it means I've got a spare one upstairs. But that's the 3D printed head in the plaster. The plaster process is really fantastic as well because you can actually impregnate pigment into it as you print. So you can print in 3D sculpturally and in colour. But we decided just to go for the slightly cheaper, much easier version of it being a plain print. This is the head installed in the exhibition, and it's installed on a mannequin that's wearing one of the smocks that we know Gluck wore. And it's positioned in front of a rail that holds the dresses that Amy was talking about earlier. So these very feminine, floral 1960s dresses that Gluck gave to the museum, but we're pretty sure she never wore. And on the base of the plinth that the mannequin stand sits on, there's an excerpt from a letter that Gluck wrote about the bequest of her material to the museum. So again, through text, we're starting to get Gluck's voice into the exhibition. That's it from me. Thank you. So this is the part I've been really excited about, because if anyone's got any questions, I get to throw this at you.
And I don't, because I'll miss.
I won't throw it, but I'll bring it round. But these are our new mics. They're great. Has anyone got any questions?
Or comments, or anything.
Or comments.
Or just responses, something you liked or didn't like, or...
I'm not going to throw it. I'll just hold it anyway. I'll put it down. Hold it anyway. Thank you.
I mean, it's phenomenal that I thank you both very much. And I'm just sort of amazed at the meticulousness and detail and the complexity of bringing this exhibition together on Gluck, and all the kind of strategies and byways and pathways that you took and you rehearsed and reconsidered. Did you have any regrets?
You go first.
Well, I think partly because we're based in the centre here,
Yes.
and I think we both have the same strategy that if I take on an exhibition, and I always say to the students, the first thing is, you have to find a subject.
Yes.
And Gluck was a fascinating subject, but then I also want to be able to engage with that subject in ways that are not necessarily challenging convention, but that to really think rigorously about, not to accept, the way that things are always exhibited, and to think, if it's a mass-produced garment, should it be exhibited differently from a high-fashion garment? Just to try and think about, really, for me, obsess on the objects and think about how the way you can transfer stories onto those objects to give them meanings. And so, just different ways of presenting an exhibition and engaging with visitors. But we did talk endlessly, but I think I only want to work on a project that is thought-provoking in some ways, and not everyone will always like everything, but that's fine too. And I have to say, I've been at the museum today and given talks, and yesterday, because the last week, so suddenly there's loads of things, and people really, really like it. And there's lots of other strategies that we haven't talked about. We put what looked like our research on the walls, and we sort of presented questions about, well, did Gluck wear this? The evidence is she was 5'2". This dress is for someone 5'6". Nesta looks about 5'6". It's reasonable to suppose, Nesta was the love of her life. Garments are a holder of meaning. That Gluck preserved the dress is of the woman she loved. But we'll never know. And today, actually, a man came from GEMS, which is elderly gay men's group in Brighton, and he came up and said, well, have you considered that Gluck liked people dressing up? And he said, I only know about men, but I know that men might buy clothes for another man to wear. You don't know for sure. And we said, well, we absolutely don't know for sure. But we do know that Gluck lived in the country. She had one relationship after another, and certainly when she fell in love with Nesta was completely monogamous. But no, we'll never know. But that's the intriguing thing, isn't it?
And from
Groundbreaking exhibition.
Thank you.
In the sense that, in many ways you've interrupted the conventions of curatorship, haven't you?
Yeah, it's not a classic art historical exhibition. It's not a dress historical exhibition. I think it's trying to tell the life of a person through the artifacts that they preserved, through other evidence that survived, and then, trying to engage with the questions that arise when they don't have provenance, because certainly the other groups of one person's wardrobe in Brighton Museum, they've come with provenance. The person has given them or a relative's given them. There's evidence, that they wore those clothes. There's often accompanied by receipts. There might be a biography that says they were worn in a certain place. So you've got a historical provenance for them, whereas these came without, apart from the Howard Costa portrait of Gluck wearing the smock, actually without any categoric provenance whatsoever.
So I've had time to think about it now. And I'll say, I wouldn't say it's an absolute regret.
Oh yeah, I didn't say.
But there's a point. But there was a point where Amy and Martin had got the contact details for the person who owns Medallion. We thought we were going to get it on loan from him, and then the loan was turned down. And I think there was a point there where we all had to talk to ourselves and get over it. And actually, in the end, there wasn't a lack, I don't think. I think what else we did in the exhibition more than covered for not getting that key painting. But if you're asking about regret, I'd say it's a bit of a shame we didn't get that medallion, but, you know, in the end, we didn't get it.
But also it was part of the narrative, because the painting was lent to the Fine Arts Society, and it's been lent to an exhibition about Virginia Woolf at the Tate and St Ives. It was rejected for the Queer British Art exhibition, and it was rejected for ours. So we don't know the person who owns it, but for whatever reason, they own this painting, and for some reason they feel uneasy, unwilling to lend it to a project which is associated with queer identities. That would seem to be the reason. But we did get the image in. We were determined to.
Yeah.
We put it in the Virago. We took the Virago book to bits. And at one point we did discuss having a whole wall of them and sort of thinking, like, you know, we'll bombard the exhibition with images.
Yeah, so you can see we got the book cover.
But, you know, I've done other exhibitions where, you know, I did an exhibition about the Land Army, and then the museum said to me, oh, you're going to be really gutted because the Imperial War Museum has closed its doors. And I just thought, no, it just means I'll go on another journey, and actually I'll have less obvious objects. So you work with what you have, but I think what was thrilling was the fact that we talked and talked and talked, and it was the composition of the three of us working together with different sort of preoccupations.
And I think I'm lucky because I'm not a curator, and I've never been a curator, and I've never wanted to be a curator, so I don't have to work within those expectations. So in some ways, I've, you know, sometimes it's an advantage, sometimes it's not, but it's great to not have to take that role and perpetuate it.
Yeah, whereas I did things that I think historically I would have been uneasy with. There was, in the Diana Suhami book, she writes about how Gluck she had the relationship with Nesta. It was over by the 1940s. Nesta returned all the love letters, and then Gluck lived with Edith for over 30 years. Now, she kept the love letters from Nesta in a Charles Jourdan shoebox. After Edith had died, Gluck found the box, and on it was written in Edith's handwriting, all lies. So Edith always lived in the shadow of Nesta, but before she died, she discovered the box of love letters from Nesta, and she'd left this note. And Jeff said it did something to his insides, and he said, oh, do you know where the box is? And we said, oh, it's just sitting on a shelf in the garage where the archive files are kept.
And so I was really determined to get the shoebox into the exhibition.
Well, I felt fine with that. I felt fine with showing the letters.
But Amy wasn't so fine when I asked her to forge the post-it note. But
I did.
Did it? So we've got the actual shoebox.
Yes, yes.
We've got the actual letters. The post-it note had gone missing. For me as an exhibition maker, to recreate a post-it note isn't a problem.
And for me, I feel... we didn't say it was the real thing, but for me, I feel slightly uneasy. But I think because I was working for Jeff, I sort of went with the theatre of it. And if I was working on my own, I might not, I don't know. But in some ways, that's the beauty of a collaboration, because I think there are things in the exhibition which I've totally bought into and I think are wonderful. And I mean, I'm having this incredible feedback from everyone. But there are things that I think on my own I probably wouldn't do.
And I suppose I'm interested in the kind of potential emotional impact of an exhibition as the potential emotional impact of any expressive medium. So when I read Diana Suhami's book, reading that point about finding the shoebox with the post-it note with all lies written on top, I mean, it's making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up now. So that's what I wanted to recreate. The fact that one part of that narrative is inauthentic, I'm willing to sacrifice for the emotive response or the emotive potential.
And the suggestion is that the contents of the shoebox are inauthentic too.
No, the letters.
No.
The letters are...
No, but what I'm saying, if it's all lies, I mean... If
Oh, sorry, I see what you mean.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. No, Edith was...
Yeah.
But that's the beauty
Yeah.
about doing a collaboration as well as, and I think you end up with an exhibition that is much richer, because actually what you probably get is the best of everyone.
And the handwriting on the letters is almost so indecipherable, you'd have to stand for hours
Well,
to
I've tried.
Yeah.
I try and transcribe some of them.
Yeah.
So it's been a really thrilling project, and I think it's something I'm really proud of. And the collaboration is good, because really all history is a construct. Every exhibition we do, you know, whatever narratives I try and put into an exhibition, as an object-based curator who's interested in authenticity, and actually it's going to always show my preoccupations, because I'm always going to choose that object in relation to that object. I'm always going to tell this story in relation to these 500 stories. So it's a narrative anyway. So I think
we just pushed it a bit further.
Yeah, so it's been good for me, because I think it's made me a bit more it's made me more receptive.
I think it's part of my process. There's this continual interrogation as well. And I worked on another project with Amy before this, and I did warn her before we started that when I'm working, part of my process is constant thing of saying, why are we doing that? Why do we do that? Why do we do that? And when you start interrogating those conventions of exhibition making, other than habit, they're often foundationless. So I guess that's where my practice comes from. But the fantastic thing about these boundaries we push in very small ways is, Brighton's a regional museum with a very conventional visitor demographic, and there wasn't really one point where Brighton said, oh no, that's too much, that's not going to work. There was one thing we had to sit down and talk with them about, which is actually outside the exhibition, not inside it, but they were more than happy to try out all of the things that we came up with.
I'd worked with them before, and I'd been really amazed at the freedoms I'd had. So in the Land Army exhibition and things, and so I knew that we would have. They are receptive to being experimental, which is thrilling, more so than maybe a big museum. I don't know. So it's been really. It was a very low budget exhibition. Half the budget went on careering the paintings, which we haven't really talked about, and we only went within a 100-mile radius. So there was an amazing portrait on a private yacht in Monaco that we were told we could borrow, but it was out of the question.
It would have been most of the budget.
Yeah, and we would have loved to have had the Romaine Brooks portrait, which is at the Smithsonian. It would have cost £12,000. So half the budget went on careering the paintings. So it was we worked to a very low budget, but again, it's a bit like cooking, when you haven't got much in the fridge, and you often make the best thing by being inventive. And I think also you'd shown as well that actually you don't need a lot of money to make a good exhibition.
And we're really lucky at LCF. We worked with digital anthropology, and we got a huge amount of time from them. And of course, we're not paying for it. If I'd had to contract someone to do that work, it would have ruled out that whole process. So it's really lucky that we're here doing this, because there are all of those other things that we can call on.
Yeah, and what's thrilling is it feeds into our teaching. And so, and into our practice-based PhD students. And
anyone else got a comment? Oh.
He wants to throw it.
Hey.
No, I'll put it down. I won't throw it either.
Just really wanted, because you didn't talk about the paintings, and my first question was going to be, did you show any paintings?
Yeah, I can show you images if I don't want to keep people, but
what I wanted to, because you've been talking about relationship of objects to narrative, how you then situated the paintings in relationship to the objects. What narrative did you create between the objects and the paintings?
So I was very keen that we saw it not as an exhibition but as a biography. And so what we did was we worked through Diana Suhami's biography, all the other writing we could find around Gluck. And my question to Amy and Martin was, what are the key stories from this life story that you'd like to tell? And we started quite a lengthy process of mapping them out and then mapping them against objects. And what we came up with, there was a point where we thought we had 3 galleries. We had a title with 3 words, Gluck, Art and Identity, and it seemed that we'd map that story against the galleries. Then we only had 2 galleries, and what we then had to do was map that kind of trilogy of themes into 2 spaces. And we broke down Gluck, Art and Identity into what I called 9 autobiographic fragments, so 9 narrative fragments. And I like the idea of talking of them as fragments, because then you know they're incomplete. So one was family, one was locations, one was relationships, flowers.
So we didn't write standard art historical labels. We wrote, rather than sort of commenting on the style, and she's a very versatile artist, rather than commenting on the style, we commented on, that Gluck was in a relationship with this person at this point in time, and she's in Cornwall, and I can't find my memory stick.
So for instance, in the section on locations, we had some landscape paintings that Gluck had done, but we also had 3 ordnance survey maps that showed locations where Gluck had lived in London, locations in Cornwall where Gluck had gone on holiday, and locations around the southeast coast where Gluck had lived or where she'd stayed regularly with friends. So you had the art, the conventional painting, but then you had these curatorial interventions or exhibition-making interventions that were about place as well, but in very different formats. So the objects became things that were incorporated into a biography. So I guess, we had photography, dress, archive material, paintings, drawings, the objects that I brought in as an exhibition maker, and for me they all just come together to tell those 9 biographic fragments.
I can't do this. Do you mind? I've got. Don't feel obliged to say, but I've got another presentation that's got lots of paintings on. It's in there.
That's in there. Hold on, let me get rid of mine. See if I can do this.
But she was an incredibly versatile painter, and we didn't want to start doing an exhibition which was going to say, "Oh, this is an amazing painter who's been unrecognised." But actually, when we started to see the paintings in the flesh, we thought some of them aren't good, but some of them are absolutely extraordinarily wonderful. And we became to think that she was a really good painter. And the painter completely, it's in the Gluck file, Gluck lectures.
Mm-hmm.
And if we go into, if we go into the NACF one, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry, not that one. Go to the Gluck conference,
I've
sorry.
done it now. That's all right.
If we just whiz down, I might have some.
Hold on, which one? The Gluck conference?
Gluck lecture, try that one. Yeah.
I mean, what was tricky from my perspective with the paintings particularly is that loans were coming in really late in the process. So within the spatial arrangement that we devised, I think even 2 weeks before the exhibition, there was possibly another painting going to come in. So we had to be very flexible in how we were constructing the narrative and in how we were locating them within the space. Because there was the documentary that was shown on BBC4, and that documentary was shown only a few months before the exhibition, but from that documentary people were ringing up Martin and saying, "Oh, I've got a painting. Yeah. Oh, I've got something I might be able to lend." So we knew that we had to be quite flexible. So
and nearly all the paintings are in private hands, and because Gluck was rich, she didn't have to work for a living. So there's not that many paintings, but there's a number of landscapes, and they're characterised by large sky. This is Craig, the woman Gluck first fell in love with and went away with to Lamorna. And Gluck patented this 3-tier frame, which was supposed to blend with the sort of fashionable interior, but also stand out from the frame. And it's not that original when you look at it, but she patented it. This is Craig. Sorry, this is Craig in a Cornish landscape.
I was asked by a number of journalists in interviews what I thought Gluck's personality would be like, and I think there's a story around her paintings that is quite interesting, that she would sell work from her shows because she felt it validated her work. Then she'd try and buy it back because she didn't want to lose the paintings.
This is a painting called The Devil's Altar that she painted in 1932 when she started a relationship with the flower decorator Constance Spry, and she was with Constance Spry from 1932 to 36, and they variously inspired each other's work. This is a painting which I really wanted us to borrow this. It was abroad again, called Nature Mort, which I just think is absolutely beautiful. She was very famous, and in the 1930s she became the ultimate kind of fashionable painter who painted white flowers that went into white fashionable interiors, such as those like designed by Siri Morn. This is Lilies. This is called Lords and Ladies, and she talks about saying how surprised she is that these are gendered female, and she said she felt like a bee buzzing around.
And the scale of the paintings, even within the flower paintings, the scale will go from something around that size to, Devil's Altar is huge, almost 2 meters. So the scale of the painting, even within this very hyper-realistic style, varies quite considerably.
And so this is Gluck's work shown in what was called the Gluck Room, because the Fine Arts Society in Bond Street designed these sort of vertical structures to echo the design of the frames. And you can see them so they were intended that you painted them or wallpapered them the same as the wall that they hung on. This was called the Punt. Now, surprisingly, in 1937, Gluck had an exhibition at the Fine Arts Society. They exhibited this, but they refused to exhibit this. It's called the Punt. It's Nesta and Gluck on the Punt, on the mill pond in the house in Plumpton that Nesta lived in. I don't know if they thought it was phallic. It's not even obviously two women, but they censored it.
And that was a point as well where I had discussions with Amy and Martin around the quality of the painting, because I think it's actually really not a good painting. But because we were working on constructing a biography, there was a place for it. Whereas I think if it had been an entirely art historic exhibition, I'd have had real reservations about including that picture, because it's interesting in its symbolic quality and in its place in the narrative. But I was really unsure about how well painted it was.
Yeah, whereas that didn't, to me it was
Yeah.
a narrative. And so that's some of the painting.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then there's Lady in Orange.
Do you want to pass can you pass the box?
Oops. No, you've fantastic.
Yeah.
You've come specially. Thank you. Bye, Mary.
You said earlier that the exhibition closes on Sunday.
Yeah.
Is it being moved anywhere else? Or?
We would love it to be. We would really like it to tour. You work on these things for years and years and years for no money. It becomes an absolute labour of love. And, I think there are people in the country who can't afford to come from Manchester and Liverpool to Brighton. It would be lovely for it to travel in England, but we'd love it to go to Berlin and San Francisco and New York. It's not factored in, it's highly expensive, it takes a lot of organisation.
And because a lot of the loans are coming from private collectors as well, people quite often don't want to be separated from their work for so long.
But the family are quite keen. I think it's something that it might happen in a different iteration in the future, but that if there was an interest, we certainly could get the clothes, we could certainly get all the photographs, the letters, a selection of paintings. So it might take a different form, but it's certainly something we're all receptive to, because, well, it's just such a lot of work, and it's something that's very contemporary right now. It feeds into lots of contemporary concerns. So we would like it to. And the person in the orange sweater. I'm fine, thank you.
Thanks very much. That was really fascinating to hear. I was wondering, because when you went into the archive, you were surprised by the items that they had from her. Do you think the fact that you had all of these dresses and the cheap jewellery, it completely changed the narrative and your kind of
completely, absolutely,
what it was going to look like?
Because normally, the jewellery I can't believe the museum accepted it, and part of me just thinks, Gluck was a woman who loved women. She didn't have children. She'd given one painting to the museum in the past, but was the long-term hope that Gluck might leave her house, all her paintings to the museum? I don't know, because the museum in 1978 would not have accepted that jewellery with it's cheap costume jewellery with stones missing. The charity shop wouldn't accept it. So yes, it certainly did, and that actually, far from thinking, oh, we can't put this in, it's tat, you think, actually, this is hugely important. It's a really, really interesting object, because for all intents and purposes, it shouldn't be here. So what story do we tell? So absolutely, because it would have been lovely to have had the +4 suits and the Homburg hats. But if you don't have them, it's like going on a journey. You think you're going to France and you go to Germany. Well, Germany's nice too, but maybe you end up going somewhere more experimental. You're more resourceful, perhaps, when you don't have the objects you want. But I did hear one piece of unbelievable news that Martin's just found out, that Gluck's doctor also went to the jumble sale and bought the menswear and donated it to LCF.
Really?
Yes.
The doctor that we met at the final?
No, another doctor.
Another
Dr. Dingerman.
Right.
So, I only knew this yesterday. So, I now need to go up to the archive and see if there's a whole lot of menswear that would fit me. Because if there is, it belongs to Gluck, and wouldn't that be completely unbelievable? So yeah, the exhibition could then go on in different iterations. But of all the places for it to come to, it's bizarre. So it might be in the archive here, like right under our noses.
Any other questions? Or sorry?
Hang on. I'm going to try throwing it to you.
Just because we're being recorded, so this records as well. It's not that we're obsessed with throwing cubes around.
A relationship of the art and fashion, especially you curating the fashion exhibition in the art museum and galleries, because I found the recent years there's also the fashion exhibitions in the luxury department or stores. So when you're creating the fashion exhibitions in the art museum and galleries, what kind of the things you focus on to keep the artistic merit? Yeah.
Well, I think Brighton it doesn't just have a fine art collection. Mm-hmm. It has dress, it has archaeology, it has local history. So in a way, Brighton is that kind of typical model of a UK museum which has collections of lots of different types. So in a way, an exhibition like this that brings that kind of material together sits perfectly. It's not like taking Armani to the Guggenheim and showing fashion in the Temple of Art, which I think was what contested at the time. Yeah. So I feel in many ways that what we did actually just represents the space that it was in. It brought together lots of different kinds of material that finds its equivalent in the collections that are in Brighton.
Yeah, it does.
But we brought them together into one story. Mm-hmm. And I think that's again why it was really important for me to frame it as a biography. And we talked with the press and the marketing team at Brighton at the beginning, so that story of it being biographic was embedded into the material that was put out to the press as well. So it's within that narrative of biography, yes, you bring in whatever material you can to tell that story. So, I mean, I didn't feel that the art or the broken jewellery had any discrepancy in value or weight. They were all equally as valuable in telling that story of Gluck's life.
I think we should probably round up.
Yeah.
But thank you very much. We're expecting 71 people, but it's whatever it is always good, and sometimes it's more discursive if you have a small group. So thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just before 8 o'clock, I think that's. We've actually got but we spoke for half an hour each.
Yeah, it was really good. Sorry, I didn't mic you up properly. I should have had it a bit lower.
Doesn't matter at all.
It's fine. It worked out.
Thank you. If you'll forgive me, I'm going to run.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Are you in tomorrow?
I'm in London, but I'm not in.
Oh, right, don't worry. Well, I'll see you next week. Then I think I'm in.
We need to do
Tuesday.
We've
got a date.
Oh, we have. Okay, brilliant.
Yeah, week.
That's
I think
fine.
a week Tuesday.
Okay,
yeah,
that's good.
so that's done.
I'm around.
Okay.
I'm going to the Archive of Art Design and stuff tomorrow.
Oh,
and I'm
right,
going to
okay. Oh, right. Well, I hope that's good. Yeah. Brilliant.
So, I'm watching but I can't think where I am. But no, I'm in London because I bought a season ticket for the week. I'm in London today.
Okay. Oh, well, I'll see you next week then. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, we did. Hello again. Nice to see you. Yeah, Monica came to the open day. We had a really good chat.
Somebody will buy it.
All right. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye. That was a bombshell you dropped at the end there. Yeah, I'm there now today. I was like, wow.
And you've not come across though.
Well, no, but I mean, the time that I get like a window. But because the stuff that I have seen on the labs is like Tommy Nutter and then Francis's stuff. But I mean, I wonder if it's
But it also could have just, I mean, this is a long time ago. It could have gone
It
Who
might not have
knows?
gone into the archive.
And the other thing is word of mouth.
Oh my god!
Also, someone said they gave it to a college of fashion, they might have given it to,
Central St. Martin's.
Yeah.
but they also might have given it to another institution. This is one elderly person saying this is what you did with it.
Yeah.
But it's certainly worth investigating. If you'll forgive me, I need to run.
Yeah.
Okay,
but
I'll see you next week.
I'll see you soon.
Yeah, see you next
Okay,
week.
take care, Amy.
Yeah, no, I was just like, oh. Yeah, of course. That's, yeah, I think that's
Well,
totally
if you come
nice.
across anything that looks like
Yeah, what are you doing? Yeah, what are you doing to Joanne?
You can't really.
even on keys or
Well, if you want to email me,
Yeah.
I'll come and see me and I'll
Well, I
take
mean,
it. I need to run now, but if you email me, you'll like it. My name's complicated, but if you just put my name in your phone, email me, say your name for the lecture, and then if you want to have a chat, I'll arrange to meet you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
research. Yes. Because there was
I need to run, so I'll see you next week. I
Yeah,
have a lot
it's
on.
okay.
Have a safe journey.
Bye. I'll see you soon. I don't know. Next week.
Thursday, Friday? One of those days.
Oh, we've got student presentations one day.
No, that, I thought,
Oh,
isn't
yeah.
that-
Oh, yeah.
Isn't that-
That'll be.
That's Thursday.
That'll be Wednesday.
Is it
That's
Wednesday?
in 1 week.
No, it
No, it won't be Wednesday.
It's Thursday.
I don't know.
Yeah,
What
it's
is in my
Thursday.
diary?
It is,
I haven't
it's
taken
Thursday.
one estimates, but I'll see you guys.
Thursday.
And
then
I'm
it's-
available by
And then
email.
you're seeing Antonis after that.
Oh,
Good. I forget myself.